It's interesting that we come again to Jesus walking through the world and doing remarkable things and turning situations upside down. First of all, he comes to this man who was a tax collector, someone who is known to all who are of the Jewish faith, all who are the people who see themselves the people of God, is known to be a sinner and someone to be despised. Yet Jesus goes and embraces him. And that's the amazing thing about Jesus, that he embraces those that no one else wants to embrace. We've seen it with the leper, we've seen it with the cripple, and now we see it with this man Levi, who was also known as Matthew, as one of the disciples. And it's interesting that you look at this passage, Jesus went out and basically sought Matthew out, or Levi out. Went out, found him at his tax booth, said, "Follow me." And Levi got up, left everything, and followed Jesus. It's an interesting situation that Jesus put Matthew into. I'm going to end up calling him Matthew all the time, so I'll just flow with it. That it's an interesting situation that Jesus put Matthew into. When Jesus called the other disciples, Peter and James and John, who were the fishermen, well, if they leave their fishing nets and follow Jesus and things don't work out, well, they can go back to fishing. In fact, we know that that's what Peter did at one stage. But there's very little chance that Matthew would have been able to go back from what he walked away from. When you understand the situation of how it worked, the tax system of the day was the Romans, who were the overseeing superpower at the time, had things worked out pretty well for themselves in terms of tax collecting. They found people within the communities who were greedy enough to be despised to collect the taxes for them, and they just skimmed off the money they needed and didn't really care how honest the tax collectors were. Not only that, but they gave them soldiers to make sure that they were able to take that money well. Now, we don't know much about what style of tax collector it is, and every time I read a different commentary about what type of tax collector Levi was or Matthew was, it doesn't really explain. Some people think he was sitting in a booth outside of the gate, taking some sort of poll tax as people walked in the gate. Others speculate that he was doing something else, and we don't really know. All we know is that he was sitting at his tax booth, and Jesus just come up and said two words: "Follow me." And this man, who was a sinner, who was working for the enemy and taking money from his family and his friends and his neighbours, left it all and followed. And that was just amazing, the power that Jesus can have in the life. When somebody is ready, and Jesus knows when they're ready, they come. And there's no turning back. In fact, Matthew was so excited by the fact that he'd been called by Jesus that he threw a party and invited all these people around the house. And Jesus was there, and there was this crowd of tax collectors and the other type of people that would hang around tax collectors because of the fact that they were wealthy men. So you can imagine it wasn't exactly the highest echelons of the society. In fact, there were probably prostitutes there. There were other people there with less than real views. There would have been soldiers there, perhaps. There would be people there who were just trying to get into the favour of the tax collectors so that they could get in on the money. There were people that the Pharisees described as sinners. And they were right there. And the Pharisees and the teachers of the law really got upset about this. Of this hanging out with these tax collectors, these sinners that Jesus was doing. Because Jesus was setting himself up as a holy man, a man who was there representing God. And Israel had this incredible history that led to the point, to the attitudes that these Pharisees had. And it was a very strong attitude. You need to understand the history to really get a grasp of it. Now we know that God called Abraham out to make a chosen, a special people. But God's intention right from the very start, when you go back to Genesis chapter 12, verse 1, right from the very start, when God gives Abraham those first promises as he gives them, as he calls him aside to make a special nation, is that he was going to be a blessing to the whole earth. And then you come along and you see when Moses brings the people out of Israel and they go and they get the law from God on the mountain, the 10 Commandments and the law, they are called to be a holy people, a nation of priests. And if you know what a priest is somebody who is an intermediary or a conduit between God and man. So Israel was always, the idea behind it always was that Israel was a special nation, pure and different and above and beyond the other nations, for the very purpose of pointing those other nations to God. But Israel forgot that purpose. First of all, they forgot to be a holy nation. When they got into their promised land, where they were to stand up as a shining light to who God was, they ended up embracing the pagan practices of the people they were supposed to kick out of the land and failed to. And so there's this long history of the struggle. First of all, you get in the book of Judges, where you have the cycle of sin, punishment, cry for help, salvation, sin, punishment, cry for help, salvation. This cycle over and over again. And then even after the kingdom is established under David, the people of Israel fail to be that holy people. They fail to be that royal priesthood. They keep constantly turning to the other gods of the area, to the idols and to the worship of other things, and rejecting God. And eventually God has enough of it and destroys the entire nation of Israel. First of all, he destroys the northern kingdom, and then he destroys Judah itself and allows his own holy city to be destroyed. But then finally the children of Israel get it. In exile, in Babylon, they suddenly start to understand the need to be pure. And so when the time comes and the Lord allows them to come back into Jerusalem and back into Judah and to re-establish the holy nation, they get an understanding of purity. Ezra and Nehemiah clearly indicate how they are meant to be totally separate from the pagan practices of the people around them. And probably for the first time in its history, you actually have an Israel nation that is totally devoted to the law and to what God has called. But then they go to the other extreme. As is wont for all people, having gone one extreme of watering down what God had and allowing other influences in, they go to the other extreme, where being exclusive and being a holy people become the point. And you can see the history through the Maccabees and for the establishment of the Pharisees, and the whole attitude of Israel comes to a point is that we're God's special people. We have God's law, we have all this righteousness, and we're going to keep it to ourselves. And they suddenly go to the other extreme, that instead of being a holy people with the aim of going out and showing the rest of the world who God is, being the holy people becomes the aim, and the idea of people outside of that holiness becoming part of it becomes untenable. And so that's where the Pharisees come from. They come from this tradition of saying that we are God's holy chosen people and we're not allowed to corrupt ourselves with anything. And so they stand there and say, why are you hanging out with these? Why are you being impure? Why are you sullying yourselves? Why are you making yourselves dirty by being part of these people? There are people here who will be unclean. There could be people who have eaten pig's food. There could be people who have touched dead bodies. All the things, all the purity laws that they had built up so strongly amongst themselves, they had to avoid all those things. But of course Jesus, being Christ, being God's true Son, knows and understands the true purpose of being pure. And so he says to them quite clearly, he says to them, it's not to the healthy one needs a doctor, but to the sick. I am not come to call the righteous, and possibly when he's talking about righteous, he might have his tongue in his cheek and being a little bit sarcastic, but to sinners to repentance. And And he's getting back to the point. I, as God's holy chosen one, am here to call those who are not holy so that they might become holy. I'm here as the pure one of God to reach out to those who are impure so they might become pure. I'm here to reach out. I'm here as God's healthy son to bring health and wealth to those who health and strength to those who need it most. And so Jesus is challenging the notion of this purity. He's putting it in the face that, yes, you say you're righteous, but if you're really righteous, you would be doing what I'm doing. You would be reaching out to these lost people. Just like we read in the passage in Isaiah, where God's talking to the people of Isaiah, and they say, oh, you're fasting and doing all these big fasts, but you're not maintaining my justice. And then you go back to Isaiah and God talks about how real fasting means giving to the poor, helping the oppressed, building up the weak. Real purity is using your purity to build others up. Real holiness is spreading the holiness around. Not keeping it to yourselves. Not holding it in. But they don't listen, so they try to attack from another angle. And they say to him, John's disciples. It's interesting that they highlight John's disciples, since the Pharisees tended to reject John as well as Jesus. But here they use John's disciples as an example. John's disciples often fast and pray. So do the disciples of the Pharisees. But yours go on eating and drinking. And again, it's an attack of purity, because fasting and praying is connected to the whole idea of being pure, of being set aside special for God. And they're basically saying, John's disciples are trying hard to be holy and righteous and pure before God. We are. Why aren't your disciples? And Jesus answered, can you make the guests of the bridegroom fast while he is with them? And Jesus is saying, my presence makes them holy. They're here with me. They're going to celebrate the fact that the Holy One of God, the bridegroom, is here before them. And the time will come when they will fast and pray. It's not far away, it's around the corner, when the bridegroom will retake it from them. And then they will fast. And we do know that Christians throughout history have used fasting and prayer in a very effective means to serve God. But while Christ was there, his holiness was there, his purity was there, and they needed to celebrate the fact that they were with the Lord. And we know that it wasn't something that didn't happen, because Jesus fasted and prayed while he's on earth, and I'd imagine that sometimes his followers did. It's just that they didn't do it out in the open so everyone could see it. They did it in a secret. And so we get to continue, and the Pharisees are trying so hard to break Jesus down, of oppressing him and saying, you're doing the wrong things. But he keeps saying, I'm doing the right thing. And then he comes to this parable. And I have to be honest, for the longest time, most of my life, I have struggled to figure out what this parable was about. But I think maybe I've finally worked it out, well, at least in part. Where he tells this parable, no one tears a patch from a new garment and sews it on the old one. If he does, he'll have torn the new garment, and the patch from the new will not match the old. No one pours new wine into old wineskins. If he does, the new wine will burst the skins, and the wine will run out, and the wineskins will be ruined. No new wine must be poured into new wineskins. And no one, after drinking old wine, wants the new, for he says, the old is better. And this parable at the end of these stories is something that people have struggled to understand. I'm sure if I asked people to put your hand up right now, I'd get very few that go, yeah, I get that. Because it is a bit awkward. But what Jesus is actually doing is highlighting the reality of what he has come to do. Just as he pointed out that he as the Christ, as the physician, has come for those who need it, for those who need to be sick. As he pointed out that he is the bridegroom and the people are fasting, but the time will come when he'll be taken away. And then his his followers, then they'll fast and pray. He's pointing to the Pharisees, the reality is that there's something new coming. And the old stuff isn't going to be part of it. Because what we often forget is that God is a God of newness. He's a God of refreshment. He's a God who is looking to do new and fresh things all the time. And makes a new establishment. Back again in Isaiah, we read in Isaiah 43, verses 18 and 19. Forget the former things, do not dwell on the past. See, I'm doing a new thing. Now it springs up. Do you not perceive it? I'm making a new way in the desert and streams in the wasteland. And that's what Jesus is talking about right now in this parable. And what he's pointing out to them. As he is debating with the Pharisees, who symbolised the old order of things, he's pointing out that he is bringing in something new that is not going to match up. You can't have a bit of both. So no one tears a patch from a new garment and puts it on the old. He's saying you can't hold on to your old rules and regulations and just try and patch what I'm saying onto it. And with the wineskins, he's saying you can't put what the new, fresh revelation of God that I'm bringing to you into the old ways of things, into the old lives. In fact, you can read in the whole reality that as a Christian we're supposed to become a new creature, as Paul states, and that we need to be new and fresh. Because if we hold on to the old, if we become Christians, if we say we're going to follow Christ, but then we try and hold on to our old ways, try and hold on to our old rituals, our old beliefs, our old practices, that the two are just not compatible. Now it's saying that to us, but he's saying it specifically to the Pharisees. You've got this history of your special rules and regulations, your religiosity. Well, you just can't take what I'm trying to give you and patch it onto that. I'm bringing you something new. I'm bringing you a new garment to wear. I'm bringing you new wine to drink. You've got to get rid of the old. You've got to be prepared to become new vessels to take what I have. And the part that always confused me most, that I finally feel I have a grip on, is this thing is no one after drinking the old wine wants the new. He says, the old is better. And that last little bit of this parable, he's saying to the Pharisees, you're going to reject me. Because having lived in your old ways, you've decided that that's good enough. And you're not going to embrace what is new from God. You're going to stick with your old stuff. Because you've decided that's all you want. That's what you want to live in. That's what you want to believe in. That's what you want to hold in. And so Jesus is pointing out to them that they can't half embrace him. They can't sort of hold on to the old and take the new. They have to choose one or the other. You have to choose your old life, or you have to choose new life in Jesus Christ. You can't have a bit of both. But then he's saying specifically to the Pharisees, you're going to prefer the old. And it's so true often for so many of us that we try and patch in our old stuff with the new stuff. As Christ goes on, as God progresses through this world, as God is looking to build his kingdom, he is looking to do new things all the time. He is looking to make new paths, to win new people to him, to build his kingdom. But so often we can hold on to the things of the past. We can grip hold of the things that are from our history and say, we want to hold on to the old. We don't want to give up what the past is. It may be your past sinful life. It may be the traditions that you grew up in the church. It may be all sorts of things that are in the past, that are behind us, that God has said, well, it's time to move on. But we want to hold on. And many of us can be saying, and I'm talking in general terms, not just specifically of this church, there are many who say, I don't want the new, I want to keep the old. I want the life I knew. Many who are not saved, and one person in particular who I've witnessed to a number of times, says the main reason that they will not want to become a Christian is they don't want to give up what they have now. They don't want to give up what they have now, and they recognise that becoming a Christian means giving up the old and taking on the new. And they don't want to do that. And they're just like the Pharisees that say, oh, the old, I like to stick with what I've got, thanks. I don't want anything new. But the reality is that we all need whatever God has got for us. That we need the newness of what God has for us every single day. I'm not saying that you throw out everything all the time and try and start fresh over and over again. History is valid, and the things that have happened in the past are valid, but only in so much as they build us up to be able to move forward with God's future. If there's something that's holding on, if there's something in the past that we're holding on to that is keeping us away from what God would have for us now, then we need to release what that is. And we need to give it up. And to move on. And Jesus knew that the Pharisees were not going to be able to cope with this. That they were going to reject the newness of what Jesus Christ was offering. Even though it was what God had planned from the beginning of the ages, He was bringing in a new, fresh thing at God's time and in God's place. But the established order was not going to be able to be part of it. You can't put new wine into old wineskins. You can't sew new garments onto old. When you do these things, you ruin both. They could not hold on to the things of the past to embrace what it was new. They had to become new vessels. And so do we. We need to become new vessels of the Lord every day, to be looking what new wine that He would pour into us, so that we might go out and refresh others. The title of the sermon is Real Purity. Real purity is being God's servant, of being allowed Him to work for you, to allow Him to make you a blessing to others, to allow Him to make you into the physician or the healer or the declarer or the worker or whatever He has for you in your life. Real purity does entail being separate, being different, to standing out as something special, unique from the rest of the crowd. But it's standing out for the purpose of drawing those who need God's love into His kingdom. Being pure isn't the end, it is the means to the end of growing God's kingdom, of reaching out to those who are not pure and having them embraced. But we cannot have real purity when we hold on to the impure things of the past. That we need to embrace the new future and what God has for us, and to become new vessels for Him every time.